Hey, good morning, everybody. This is a very impromptu class I'm doing on some hand sewing techniques, and we are recording this. So I just want to let everybody know that your likeness image may end up popping up somewhere in the video. This may or may not end up on the Kingdom YouTube Arts and Sciences page. But if it does, this is your blanket disclaimer that you are being recorded. So if you're not comfortable with that, you can just keep your camera off, and that'll be fine. But just to let you all know that's happening. Okay. All disclaimers aside. Okay, so I'm going to start with the basic construction seam. So we've got two pieces of fabric here. I'm using a somewhat contrasting thread so you can kind of see as I go about doing this. There are a number of types of construction seam or stitches that we can use. So the two most common are the running stitch and the back stitch. So a running stitch is basically what it sounds like, where you're gonna take the needle and you're gonna just kind of weave it in and out, and it's just gonna run. So one of the things about doing this with hand sewing, I always use a 1/2 inch seam allowance for my for my seam allowance, and so I definitely recommend seam gauge, one of these things right here. So when you can see that I just marked that at a 1/2 inch right there, and then use that. And there's a couple of ways that you can mark your seam. I definitely, when I'm doing hand construction, I definitely recommend oh, hang on a second. Hang on, Magda, I'm working on it. I know I have that here. Sorry, I'm looking for closed captioning, and I know I have it here. Live transcript. Sign. Is that working? Enable auto transcription. Maybe. Is that
Woohoo,
working?
it's enabled.
Yay, is that working okay for you?
Let's see.
Looks like it.
Got it.
Cool. Thanks for the reminder on that.
Thanks for having it.
Okay. So again, I use the seam gauge. You definitely want to mark your seam in some way. There's a couple of different ways you can do that. So this is the chalk pencil that I use. I love these things. I actually have 2 of them on the table right now. I own 4 of them. You can get these in the quilting section at Joann's. This is a quilting chalk pencil, and it comes with a variety of different colors. And this one happens to have white, and I've got one that's got the blue. So depending on the fabric that you're marking on, I just love these. I just love them a lot better than like chalk pencils or the chip, like the hand chip. So I love these things. So you can either mark these with the chalk pencil like this, or you're basically just going to go down and just use the seam gauge at 1/2 inch. Go ahead and mark that out. But one of the other things you can do is just straight pin, right? So you can just pin your 1/2 inch seam allowance, because you're going to need to keep it together anyway. So if you're by pinning it at the 1/2 inch, you can just basically just follow along the pin marks, right? And you don't necessarily have to fill the whole thing with pins, but you can if you want to, or you can do and you do a mix of the chalk pencil and the pins as well, to kind of keep it in. But you definitely want something to mark that. So I've pinned that right at 1/2 inch, and so I'll probably end up just going one side or the other. But one of the other things I'll do is I'll keep it pinned, and then as I sew into it, I'll pull a pin out, and then I'll just kind of stitch that bit, and then I'll take the pin out, because it doesn't necessarily have, because with the pin being in there, or once I take the pin out and the other one's being in there, I at least kind of have a line that I can follow. So there's a number of ways that you can kind of keep your consistency on the depth of your seam allowance, to kind of keep that straight, so that your seam allowance is consistent throughout the whole thing. So this is one of the ways you can do that, right? So I'll do the running stitch first. So basically I'm just gonna set that in, and with the running stitch, what I'll do is I will basically fill the needle, and then I'll pull it through, right? So I don't know if you can see.
And that's what I was doing on my hems.
Okay, I will show you a different stitch for the hem in a minute, because the hem stitch that I use and the stitch I use for flat felt seams, I use a slip stitch instead of a running stitch, and it's a cleaner stitch. It's also referred to as a hidden stitch because you don't see it at all. So yes, this is a running stitch, and the running stitch I use for your primary construction. If you're doing, so you said the whole thing is hand sewn, right? So you're doing construction seams too, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you see, once I've got this, basically I fill up the needle, and then I'll pull that through. And once I've pulled that through, usually when I'm just doing a running stitch, after, some folks say 4 or 5 stitches, but for me, basically, once I've filled up the needle there, I'll go ahead and poke it back through, and just I'll poke that through. This happens sometimes. So I don't know if you've run into this, Adele. See how I've got the different lengths of the thread that are, oh, can you see that? No. There you go. Sometimes as you're pulling through, you get the different lengths on the thread. It's important to be able to, when this happens, you want to pull it out some so that you have some room to work with. But basically what I'll do is I'll get the 2 ends up here by the needle, and I'll figure out which one I need to pull to get them back. Sorry about that. Can I do that a little bit more? There you go. To get them even again, because if you don't, you're going to end up with a knot right there. So yeah, once I've done a running stitch, I'll run that through, and then I'll basically just usually take my needle back through there, and I'll just do just a locking stitch right there. So one of the things that does is that kind of helps prevent it from, if something happens to that seam at some point, when you lock it right there, if you lose that thread, you're going to lose that much right there. It's not going to run out and lose the rest of it. Does it make sense?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Is that how you were doing your hem, with the running stitch with the lock stitch?
I wasn't doing lock stitches.
Okay. That's like
So
you said.
here's the, I have all the hems except one sleeve done, except once I see what you're doing, I'm probably going to call that practice and go back and pull them all out. So it's probably a good thing I didn't do a lock stitch.
Oh no, I mean it's fine. It's just when I'm doing a running stitch, that's just a thing that can be done to. It just gives it a little extra security in the stitch. It's certainly not necessary, but it's a thing that it's a thing you can do just kind of keep it all together, right? And again, this is the running stitch I use for the primary construction. When I say construction seams, I mean I'm taking these two pieces of fabric and stitching them together. This is going to be your, these are your long seams, right? So that's the running stitch. And you can see there's some gaps. You can probably see it on here. So there's some spaces there. So this will this works, right? And again, this is totally period. And it was used in a lot of it's a lot of what we see in Textiles and Clothing, which is a Museum of London book, which is an absolutely prime source material. A lot of these are Museum of London book. The Textiles and Clothing is all based on outfits that they found in the Thames River in England, and in there they say that that while the backstitch, which is what I use, the backstitch was used in period. We know that it was used on the Bayeux Tapestry, among other things. But while it was used, they didn't find the backstitch on any of the outfits that they found in the Thames. So the running they were used a running stitch instead of the backstitch. I prefer the backstitch because it is and I'll show you that in a second. It's I just think it's a cleaner stitch. It leaves a better line because when we open this up, one of the things that we end up with on this, and I don't know if you can, how well you can see this, but see how there's that kind of bacon ripple sort of thing right there. That's what you get with a running stitch. And I just prefer the back stitch because I think it's a cleaner stitch. And it leaves a cleaner line afterwards, if that makes sense. So with the back stitch, what you're going to do is you'll have that first stitch that's in there. And so now so I'm just going to go right off that lock stitch that I used on that last run there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come behind that stitch and then come up in front of it again, right? So now what I'm going to do, you can see that there. So now I'm going to put this, I'm going to enter this stitch right there on this back behind there. And I'm going to come up in front of that stitch right there. That's why it's called the back stitch, because you put it in there and then you come behind the stitch you just put in there.
So that's actually going to look like a machine sewn stitch.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's what this is basically what the machine does. And it does look like a machine sewn stitch. So like I say, you just kind of come behind it. And with as far as spacing and consistency, I think I get somewhere between 8 and 11 stitches per inch. But you can, whatever you're comfortable with. And also I can get that spacing on linen. It's a lot more difficult to get that kind of spacing on wool just because the fabric's thicker. I don't know if you can you guys see this okay? The way I'm doing this, I don't know if you can see it. So I just keep going behind the stitch before it and then pop it up in front And so you can see also I'm still pretty close to that 1/2 inch seam allowance right there. Now, obviously, well, I don't know that this really does take a lot longer than a running stitch. Because while I'm doing one stitch at a time, I'm also not doing the lock stitch at the end there. So that lock stitch, I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot of time, but it takes a second. And I'm also doing this kind of quick just so I can show you what's going on. Okay. And that's the back side. So you can see that's the back side of the back stitch. And that's the back side of the running stitch. Right. And like I said, if a running stitch is easier for you, that's fine. Like I said, totally period stitch, right? Like I said, I'm just going to run through a little bit more here because I'm going to show you the flat felt seam next. Adele, have you done flat felt seams before?
I have on machines, so I know what they are. And I'm no stranger to hand sewing. It's just, this is a really big project in comparison to what I have done in the past.
Yeah. I'll have to say, I've never done a flat felt seam on the machine. That's interesting. I mean, I guess theoretically it makes sense that you could, but yeah, I use a slip stitch for that. Slip stitch, hidden stitch, also called a stitch in a ditch. That's a ditch with the D, folks. Stitch in a bitch is a different thing entirely.
Do you always sew away from your dominant hand?
So away from my dominant hand, what do you mean?
You're sewing from left to right.
That's because I'm left-handed.
So you're sewing away from your dominant hand, dominant side.
Yeah, totally. I can't really see how you would sew. Yeah, I don't see how you could do that towards your dominant hand.
It's just when you're sewing, is as if I were following along with you, I would be sewing to your right hand. So
because you're right-handed.
Well, I'm ambidextrous. I can sew either direction.
Oh, okay. So yes, I mean, if I'm left-handed, I sew from left to right.
Thank you.
So also when I finish up a stitch right here, so if I were at the end of my string, the end of my rope, as it were, or if I was finishing up, the way I'm going to finish this is, so I'll just come behind that last stitch right there. And then I'll just kind of pull this through. And what I'll do is I'll just take the needle and just wrap it around here like 2 or 3 times. And I just pull it.
Will you pull the project closer to you? It's way down at the end.
Sorry about that. I was trying to get the
No.
camera to be more straight down there. How's that?
Oh, yeah, excellent.
Because I keep wanting to have it here, so I think I'm showing it better there. So let me go ahead and do that again. So like I said, I'll just come up behind there, and then I'll just take the thread like that, and then I'll just wrap the needle around a couple of times, and then just pull that through, and that allows me to lock that right down there at the seam. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So that's the running stitch and the back stitch, and those are the two that I use primarily for seam construction. And again, to show you the difference between the two. So this top part,
Oh, yeah, much nicer.
that top part is the running stitch, and that part is the back stitch.
And what was the name of the book that you mentioned?
It's called Textiles and Clothing. Hang on a second. Let me see if it's down here.
I have a copy if you can't find yours.
Do you have it handy?
I do, just a sec.
I know I have it. I just don't know.
She's
where
a
it is.
pillar of patience. We've both been married 54 years.
Oh, no, where is it?
And that's taken a lot of patience on her part.
I said, I know I have it here, but
And
Stockbound Museum of London. Russian shows up.
who said they had it?
every once in a while, I realize she hasn't forgotten all those things. Read rightfully so. I'm thankful for the gospel.
All right, who said that they had? Oop, unmute. Unmute.
All right, I'm back.
Okay.
My, I'm borrowing my daughter's headphones.
Like I said, I've got it. I've got it around here somewhere. Let me
But it's
spotlight
this
you for a
book?
second.
It's the Museum of London has a series of these books.
Yep.
It's by Elizabeth Crowfoot, Francis Pritchard K. Stanley. It's called Textiles and Clothing, 1150 to 1450. It's amazing if you are interested in clothing construction of that time period. A lot of the Museum of London things that are like actually from England and not from other places are basically things that they dredged from the Thames. And so it's kind of like a 1,000-year garbage pile, which is like amazing
Yeah.
archaeology. It talks about the fabric, a lot of fragments of fabrics and garments that were found, very few complete things, but it talks about threads. And something like this would have been like basically what was sold to someone. This is like a usable hank of thread, or it would have been at one time.
What was the author's last name?
Elizabeth Crowfoot, Crowfoot. If you look up Museum of London Textiles and Clothing, that should get you in their direction too. But
Yeah,
it
it's
has
on
a lot of
Amazon.
clothing fragments. So this is like a sleeve. You can see it has like the buttons, and they'll do like really thorough analysis of all the things they find. Like this is the weave of the fabric. This is the spin of the thread. There's some other stuff about like how the weaving and stuff was accomplished. They do have some tablet woven pieces, and a lot of fragments they have are sewn. So they will also talk about stitches. So like this is a fragment, we don't even know what it is, but it's the how they talk about like stitching together selvages to like raw ends, because this is a selvage stitch to that.
Yep. Yeah, it's an amazing series of books. I highly recommend it. And those are what we refer to as prime source materials, because these are things that are based on things that have been carbon dated to the period, so that we know that these things existed within our period. And they've done like chemical analysis of the fibers. Like in the back of the book, one of the sections they have is they put them on a spectrum analyzer, and they were able to determine the dyes that were used to dye the wool. So it's that kind of stuff. It's an amazing resource, and it is kind of the holy Bible of documentation. So definitely recommend that. And it's got some of these techniques in it that I'm talking about as far as sewing techniques. Okay. Any other questions so far?
Good one.
All righty. So we're gonna go on to the flat felled seam. So I've got this seam that I put together. That's it. Move this way. Spotlight. Okay. So again, the iron being your best friend with this whole thing. When I'm using linen, I use the highest setting on there, and I use steam quite a bit. So with the seam, it's important to be able to iron this out as flat as we can to begin with. So one of the things that I'll do to start with is I'll push the seam both ways from the inside of it, right? So I'll get it there, and then I'll push it this way, right? And what that gives me is when I get over here, that will flatten out the seam on the inside so that I can get a good press this way. So having a good press on the outside, I mean, that's the part that people are going to see, right? So we want to make sure that that's got a good press on the outside that's laying flat. And that's something you don't necessarily get. If I was to just open this up and just butterfly this to begin with, without ironing it from the outside as well, it's not going to lay as flat. Does it make sense? So
Yeah.
when I'm doing the flat felled seam, so the idea of this is what we're going to do is I'm basically going to cut down one side of this, and I'm going to use the other side. I'll see if I can go that way so that I can hold it towards you. So I'm going to cut down this half of that basically, and then I'm going to use this to kind of fold over the top of it. Now, this is important because with linen and silk in particular, we need to finish the seams somehow, because if you don't, it'll shred. The linen and the silk weaves are just so fine that they just, I mean, like this right here, right? I mean, these threads that are coming out of here already, especially if you wash it, that'll just, if you don't finish your seams, you wash that, it'll just shred right out. All right. So usually when I'm doing this, I'll use some of these tiny little scissors here, because with the detail that I need to be able to cut that half there, I prefer the control that I get with a smaller pair of scissors like this compared to the bigger set of gingers. These are good for, obviously, for cutting through lengths of fabric, but for something as fine as this, I usually use the smaller ones. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to cut this in half. Right, like that. And I'm using iron to press that forward. Now, the nice thing about linen, like you were saying, Adele, you can kind of do the finger iron, but the iron actually works a lot better. It's just going to lay a lot better. But the nice thing about linen is when you do iron it out like that, with an iron with steam, it's basically going to hold it's going to hold the shape a little bit better. I'm just going to move this up a little bit. So at this point, what I'm going to do, then I've got that folded over. So I'm just going to basically kind of tuck that in. Like that. And then iron that out. So you see that there? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So now, once we got that folded over, Gotta flip this over because of my left-handedness and all.
Mhm.
Again, once that's ironed out, I don't really need to, you can pin that, but you really don't need to. Once you get that ironed out. Hang on a second. I have to shift my operation over here a little bit. Okay. Can we still see that? Okay. There you go. Get that focus there. All right. So now, we're gonna do. This is the stitch that I use for the hem. This is also what I use for the flat felled seams. You can use a whip stitch. Whip stitch is also very period. I should probably show you how to do that as well. So basically with the whip stitch, I'm going to come in behind this seam here. So whip stitch basically just goes in circles, kind of like a whip. And I don't know if I can actually. So it's basically what you can do with the whip stitch actually is you can almost fold that in half. The whip stitch is fast. No doubt about that. Almost it's funny, I do the slip stitch so much that when I'm doing whip stitch on something, it feels dirty. Feels like I'm cheating. And to me, the slip stitch doesn't take that much more time. But I've been doing it a lot too. So that's the idea of the whip stitch. I'm just doing a few of those. That's the idea of that. Let me see that. Does it make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so that's whip stitch. And again, totally period. And if you prefer that, then yeah, you can absolutely do that. The slip stitch is also period. And to me, it just looks better. It's a cleaner stitch. I think it may be more secure as well, but it's just a cleaner stitch. So it's also sometimes called a hidden stitch, stitch in a ditch, or possibly a convent stitch. And the idea of this is what I'm going to do is, and it's kind of hard to tell, but I'm just going to pick up just a couple of threads on this backside. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the needle into the groove and into the slip, basically into the ditch. And then I'm going to run it just a little bit through that ditch, and I'm going to come out again from there. So like I said, just pick up a couple of stitches, put it in there. I don't know if you can. I don't know how well you can see. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And we'll pull that through.
Now, I learned that stitch as a hemming stitch, so that's interesting to know the different names of it.
Yeah, it's called a hem stitch as well. I mean, that's what I use it for. And essentially with what you're doing with this flat felled seam is you're making it, you're sewing a hem. And it does, you can see the difference in this on the running stitch that you were using and how I use that as a construction stitch, as opposed to this stitch which we're using on the hem.
It's a finishing stitch.
Yeah.
You know, to make it It really is. It's something that is intended to, like you said, make it look clean.
I use it for like all of my construction stitches.
And with just that much that I've done there, you can see the difference between the whip stitch and the hidden stitch, the slip stitch. See that?
Yes.
Okay. And then that's what it looks like on the outside. So you can see I'm just picking up a couple of stitches. And again, this is the whip stitch that we did before, and you can kind of see, and granted, that's a sloppy, that is a sloppy whip stitch right there as well, because I just don't use that much. And I'm using contrasting thread on this so you can see what I'm doing here. But when you use a matching thread, you can see that it's just these little marks that are going to be coming through because you're just picking up a couple of stitches on the outside. And so it's just not gonna, you're just not gonna see it on the outside. So one of the things I get, and this is why it's important to iron this out as best you can. If you don't iron this, one of the things that you may end up getting is this. So this is down here where I haven't finished the seam yet, but sometimes you'll end up with this thing here where it kind of folds back on itself a bit, and you end up with just a little bit of overlap that just kind of, it just doesn't lay as well. So that's why ironing it out and getting a good getting it to lay good and flat before you cut the flat felt seam makes all the difference in there. That's also the running stitch up there too. So, and you can see that again, this is where I did the running stitch up top, and then this is where I did the back stitch down here. So in the back stitch with the slip stitch versus with the whip stitch right there. So does that make sense?
Yes.
And then same kind of thing here to finish that off. You know, I'll just pick up a couple of stitches, just kind of run that up through there. And then wrap that around a couple of times, pull it through. Okay, any questions on that?
No.
Okay. So let's see, running stitch, back stitch, whip stitch, and the split stitch. That's what we got covered so far, and the different functions for each of those things. Now I'm going to do, I'll go ahead and show you how I roll a hem. I could probably just use that, any one of these. And again, I use the split stitch on for the hem as well. But again, it's super important to iron out the hem as well. And that's one of the things that I noticed on the one that you posted a picture of. By the way, Adele, keep posting pictures. Take pictures of everything.
Okay.
And post it up there. As my friend Mr. Kalja says in Ontario, bitches love progress pictures. We do. We just put it out there and take pictures of everything, and if possible, continue taking pictures of different steps of the progress along the way. Because one day in the not so distant future, you're going to look back and you're going to be able to see the difference between what you're doing now and what you're doing 2 years from now. Oh, hang on.
So
Yeah,
that's your hidden stitch then.
Hang on, let me spotlight you here.
Oh.
Okay. And show me that again. Yes. Yes. Much better. Did you iron that out?
Not yet.
Okay.
My iron's upstairs. I'll go get it in a minute though.
Okay. So
I
yeah,
just had to try and make sure I locked it into my brain.
yeah, that's, yep, that is it. That is it. And you see how much cleaner that is?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think more secure as well. The slip stitch
That
in the
just
back.
means that I have 200 yards of finished hem that I got to take out.
No, no, you don't have to take it out because everything that you do is a prototype for the next thing that you're going to do. So, because you have more hem that you still have yet to do, right?
Yes, I have a whole very long sleeve hem left to do.
There you go. So you're going to use this new stitch on the rest of the hem.
Right.
And if somebody were to look at it, which, you know, I mean, that's up to you as to whether or not you want to let somebody look at it, except to show somebody else who is going through a similar thing. This is what it looked like when I first got started, and this is what it looks like with the two different stitches. All right. But everything you do is a prototype for the next thing that you do. Everything. I always say do mock-ups first because I mean, like yesterday when I made that boxed in cloak, I hadn't made one yet. So I had an old bed sheet that we weren't using anymore. So I cut out a boxed in cloak out of bed sheet. That's your mock-up. You want to use bed sheet or ducky bunny fabric or, you know, the shit fabric that we have laying around before you start cutting into $20 a yard wool. So always do mock-up, always do prototypes. And then, yeah, everything is a prototype for the next thing that you're going to do. So yeah, do not pull out all that seam, just leave it as is. But yeah, take pictures of everything. Because again, it's like you're going to be able to see your own personal progress in a series of things. And if nothing else, as you're taking pictures of the various stages of things, I mean, I'll occasionally, I mean, when I was doing this outfit for Rifkin, you know, I'm sitting on the couch doing my flat felt seams like this. And occasionally I'll just, you know, take a picture of my dog sitting on my lap while I'm hand sewing. And to be able to just kind of show people what that looks like, right? Because I mean, it's all neat and well to have a picture of the finished product, but there's a lot of steps in all of the stuff that we do, especially with costuming, where people don't know what's going on and the different steps that it takes. And so by taking pictures and just posting those up there, other people get to see what that process is like. And so you're helping other people by taking pictures and posting pictures of everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that was more so for everybody else, not just for you, but yeah, take pictures of everything. All right. So the hem. So this is angled, but it's going to work just fine. So I do roughly 1/2 inch hem as well. Actually, it kind of ends up taking up a bit more than a 1/2 inch. What I'll do is, you know, I'll just fold this at it, you know, somewhere between 1/4 and a 1/2 inch. And again, with linen, you can do this where you can give it a press and it'll stay. You don't necessarily have to pin it. So I'll do that first fold, and this first fold I'll do it as about as small as I can, because again, I'm wanting to use roughly a 1/2 inch for the total of it. But once I've got that first fold in there, then I just roll that over, because you don't want to stop with just that, right? Because that's the edge of the fabric there, and that's, I mean, you can do a whip stitch to just finish that off, and you know, from the outside it looks like this, right? It looks like it's a finished hem. But I'm gonna roll that over one more time. And it looks like that is what you had done on yours there, Adele.
Yes, it is a double roll.
Yeah. So, and basically from there, once I've got that iron down, then I'll do the slip stitch just like I showed you with the other one to tack that down. And then it ends up with that, you know, good clean line and, you know, minimal amount of fabric rolled into it. You don't want to you know, like I said, I rolled that at about a 1/4 inch and then another 1/4 inch on top of that, which gives me roughly a 1/2 inch. But you don't want to do a 1/2 inch and then fold over that and then do another 1/2 inch, because then you've got you're using a full inch of fabric at the bottom to do that. Does it make sense?
Yep.
You got any questions so far from anybody else? In all right? All right. So I happen to be working on a wool coat for my wife. So this is a just slightly different thing about working with wool. Hold on a second. There's that one. Was I starting down on the other end? Oh, hey. There it is. I knew I had a needle in here somewhere. It's still in there. So, all right. So, of course, one of the really important things about working with wool and having dogs is this little tool right here. Lint roller. Because damn. Right.
Yeah, I swear, I vacuum a whole dog every day.
So one of the things about working with wool, it's a thicker fabric and also it has a different weaving construct. The wool does not shred the way that linen and silk do. So rather than doing a flat felled seam on this, what I've done, let me try to find a seam that can lay flat. Ew, dog hair. Ew. In the textiles and clothing book, it actually tells us that the wool outfits that they found, the wool seams were not really finished the way that we have to with the linen. So they didn't do a flat felt seam. In fact, one of the things that's in there that I really love, that I may get to eventually because I think it'd be cool, is they actually took the wool edge and they tablet woven edging, where they wove the trim directly onto the outfit.
So want to see what that looks like?
What's that?
Do you want to see what that looks like?
Yeah, let me go ahead and spotlight you there, because this is super.
Let me grab it.
Yeah, this is super cool. Again, it's something I haven't done, but I really love it.
Please be very gentle in your judgments. This is like 10 years old and is kind of starting to fall apart on the inside.
Oh, so you actually did it?
Yeah.
Oh, nice. I thought you were going to I thought you were going to pull up the book.
Oh, no. So, again, this is very much based on the Museum of London book, where it has this little silk facing that is usually a ribbon. This is actually like a really narrow piece of fabric that's folded in on itself. Oops, I am pressing my keyboard. I apologize. Mouse.
Oh no!
Okay.
Hi, Ado.
Sorry. And then you can see on the very focus. 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 Okay. Let's try that again. Okay.
Hey, there you go.
And so there are whip stitches where the facing is being held on and running stitches kind of holding the facing in place. But you can see on the very edge, there's this dark blue braid. That is a 2-card tablet weaving where the weft thread, where the weft thread is actually sewing it to the like very outside edge, basically, as it's being worked.
And is that wool?
This is wool. Yeah, it's wool with a linen lining.
Right. Brilliant.
And the tablet weaving itself is silk.
Is what? Silk? Okay.
Silk.
Yep.
Yep.
That is that is brilliant and nicely done. Very nicely done.
It was very annoying.
Yeah.
But
That's
I
good
will
stuff.
say once again, like the thing is like 10 years old and the linen lining is kind of falling apart a little bit. That that edging, which I took all the way around the neckline and down the front opening, it's perfect. Like it's not, it hasn't stretched out. It hasn't,
Yep.
hasn't done anything.
And that's one of the things we see in the textiles and clothing is where you have the finished edges and you have the flat felt seams, where seams are finished, the fabric, you know, being in the River Thames for years, the fabric will disintegrate long before the seams do. Those seams are gonna be in there and they're gonna hold up.
Well, you know, that makes sense because they couldn't go down to Walmart and replace a piece of clothing.
Mhm.
When they did clothing, they had to make it last. So they came up with all these ways to increase
Yeah.
the longevity of what they had because they could not easily reproduce it or quickly
Yeah.
either.
And that even
Yeah.
speaks to a lot of kind of what got thrown out is you have this garment and you know the seams it's just not like what is needed anymore. It doesn't fit the person or something like that. They'll tear off the seams and chuck them in the garbage basically, and then they'll just recut, reuse into whatever for the remaining pieces and like sew it again for somebody smaller or you know boil it down for rags if it's linen or something like that.
So so like I said, in textiles and clothing, they talk about how the wool seams were not finished the same way that linen was, linen and silk, because it wasn't as necessary, because the wool just doesn't fray the same way that linen does. So in finishing something that is wool, you pretty much could leave it as is. But one of the things that I like to do with this is this just what I call the butterfly finish. And you can see what I've done is I just basically open up the two seams, kind of butterflied it out, and then I'm tacking that down on the sides so that basically just so it lays flat. Again, this is just one of those things that is not entirely necessary. I just think it looks
But it's
cleaner.
pretty.
Yeah, it's pretty.
Added detail.
Yeah, it's and this has been, you know, like I said, this is going to be a wool coat for my wife. And yeah, it is a lot of hand finishing, but I just like the way it lays a lot better. And you can see I think this is one of the seams I was working on. I need to get back to. Hang on. And let me get my dog off this part too. Oops.
Yeah, I just bought 2 of those rollers yesterday.
Oh yeah, I get a 6-pack at Sam's. So this, I don't know if you guys can see that. So I've got this side that is complete. and this side still needs to be tacked down. I'm working from the top down on this. So yeah, I'll just and I'm just using because there is no ditch to do the hidden stitch with. I'm just basically just doing a whip stitch on this. But I also do it in a similar fashion where I'll kind of just pick up a couple of threads and run it underneath the fabric and then pop up again. And again, with this being tacked down like this, and especially being a dark color, you really can't see what those stitches look like. But yeah, I'll just tack that down, fold it over. Any questions on that? Any other questions so far? All right, tell you what, I'm going to take 2 seconds to run up and refill my coffee, and then I'm going to show you how to do the cloth buttons. So give me just a second.
It's mine.
Is it?
Yes.
A pencil.
Alrighty. So when we got started here, Angela was saying that she wanted to know how to do cloth buttons. So we'll find some scrap here to do that with. Cloth buttons are also in the Museum of London series. It's actually in a book called Dress and Accessories. Also an excellent book. It has the cloth buttons. It also has, so that particular book is cool because again, this kind of tells you about the extent of the research that they did and why this is considered prime source material. And Dress and Accessories, for the metal buttons that they had, they have a list of metallurgic composition for different types of buttons from different eras. So, like they say, for 1200, it would use like this much copper or this much tin or this much lead or what have you. And it kind of goes through a progression of, button styles and composition. And it's got a whole chart of, depending on your period, this is the type of buttons that you would use. But the cloth button is in there. So as I was saying earlier, for the cloth button, everybody's familiar with these right here, the little needle cases, right? Get them at Joann's for like what, $5 or whatever it is. This turns out
Or the dollar store.
Or the dollar store, yeah. This turns out to be precisely the size of diameter that I need for cloth buttons. So basically just put that on there. I'll probably cut out a couple of these. Now, one of the things I love about cloth buttons is you get to match the outfit that you're working with if you'd like, or you can contrast with the outfit that you're working with. But I can make as many as I need to, and I don't have to worry about whether or not I bought enough buttons. And you're making them out of the scraps of things that you're already working with, so they're a lot cheaper than buttons. And I know people can, I know everybody's got their button sources where they can get super cheap buttons, and that's great. But these are pretty much free. Okay, so one of the things I was talking about earlier before we got started was, when I first started doing the cloth buttons, you know, I had this image of, well, they're, you know, they have substance to them, and that they, you know, that they needed to be stuffed, you know, that they needed to have something inside of them. And what I came to find out was what they have inside of them is themselves. Because you can see this is a 2-inch diameter circle. We're basically going to stuff it with itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on the very edge of the button, and I'm going to do a basting stitch, which pretty much comes off the same as a running stitch, right? But on the, like I said, on the very, very outside edge, I'm just going to kind of run this through, and we're going to go all the way around it. And you can do these stitches as, you know, as close or as big as you want. But it is kind of important that you keep it as close to the edge as you can. But again, with this being linen, if you get it too close to the edge, it's gonna fray out. So just a quick caution there. And yeah, they take a bit of time compared to buying buttons and just tacking the button on. But again, there's advantages and disadvantages. But I love them.
Well, I tried to follow what they were doing in the Medieval Tailor's Assistant for buttons, and I just could not get them to work right.
Yep. This is basically it. And the one that's in Medieval Tailor's Assistant is a great book. It's a great book to start with. One thing you'll notice about that book is a lot of the references that they have, a lot of the pictures that they use are directly from the Museum of London books, which is fine. I mean,
Okay.
they list them in the bibliography, and that's fine. So it's not, I'm not saying it's plagiarism. I'm just saying that as far as source material goes, the Museum of London.
Yeah, I knew it was good. I knew it was secondhand source material. It wasn't prime source.
And it is good secondhand source material. It really is. It's a great place to start. And honestly, when I decided that I actually wanted to be a clothier, the first book that I bought was Medieval Tailor's Assistant, and I will totally recommend it to anybody who's getting started in this. Okay, so now
go ahead. I couldn't get the buttons to work, so I give up on them. So This
I'll
is
show you.
cool.
So now that we've got the, you see, I've got the basting stitch going all the way around that, right? Now
Yes.
what we're gonna do is we're gonna draw this up like a purse. Right? And then the key here is we need to flatten this out. Right? So that everything that you gathered up is in the center. And that effectively becomes your stuffing. Okay, so we've got that. And that's what it looks like on the outside. Okay. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna do that basting stitch going around one more time. Again, right at the edge.
Hey, Ange, we got to figure out where we're going to put buttons on this dress because I need to do some pieces too.
It's cool,
Okay.
huh?
Yes, it is. Very cool.
So Your Grace,
Yes.
the project that I'm actually working on is one that I want to use in competition, which is
Okay.
probably why I will pull the other hems out and do them what I am now viewing to be the correct way.
Okay. Well, and like I said, even for a competition, it is perfectly valid to demonstrate various techniques, right? And you say, this is where I used a running stitch for this, and this is where I used a slip stitch for this. And so, I mean, that is a thing that you can actually incorporate into your entry, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay. I didn't think about doing that.
Yep, and then just include why you made the change and what you learned from the differences. Added
Yeah.
bonus points in your documentation.
Okay.
Can
so
I
now-
say, can I say Duke Sean says so? Is that a primary source?
I mean, I have used similar references where I said, well, my friend told me this. But I also I also expected that that such references would be reflected in my scoring, if you know what I'm saying. So after I did that basting stitch all the way around, now I'm going to draw that up again.
A little fat round button.
Little fat round button.
Oh my heck.
Pretty neat, right?
Yeah. And
Okay.
where are we gonna put those? Those
I'll
are
show
cool.
you. I'll show you. Hang on. So one of the things I do after this is to kind of keep it all together is I'll kind of cross through a couple of cross through the whole thing. So I'm putting that needle all the way through there, right? To kind of help draw
To
that in,
stabilize it,
to
yeah.
stabilize it, right? And then I'll go, you know, I don't know, 3 or 4 of these, you know, just kind of going crossways to kind of keep it there. Now, the other thing, so once we have this in place, so you can see, like I said, I'm using a contrasting thread so you can see what's going on here. But that kind of secures it, right? And that's your button. So, and then, so now what we have is we have this button attached to the thread, right? And I usually make the buttons as I'm putting them on, right?
Oh, that makes sense, because then you don't have to cut thread and.
Exactly. So, and what we'll do, I'll go ahead and put one on the edge of this, edge of the coat here, kind of show you how that goes on there.
I'm so glad I'm not the only one that has dog hair everywhere. That makes me
It's
so
everywhere.
happy.
Yeah. So, and I'm not going to go over buttonholes today, because honestly, I mean, my buttonhole stitch is just really not that good. I just haven't done a lot of it. You know, I'll be totally honest. Usually when I'm finishing the dress for my wife, I'll just do the buttonholes on the machine. That's a thing eventually I will get to, but I just haven't. But when you're putting these on, usually with cloth buttons, they are going to go on. They're going to go on the edge of the fabric, right? They're not going to be inset like we think a button is. They're right on the edge of the fabric. Does that make sense?
Can you,
And-
instead of using buttonholes, can you use like loops?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think dress accessories might have something with the loops in there. I'm not sure. Marguerite, do you know if that's in dress accessories, that type of thing?
I'm not sure. I have the dress accessories book. I'm not as, I haven't studied that one quite as in
Yeah.
depth.
So yeah, you could probably use loops. But yeah,
I know there's a lot
typically-
of pictorial evidence, especially when you get into a little bit later stuff. Like 16th century portraiture shows a lot of loops.
So yeah. So that's a thing you can do for sure.
When you're doing your buttons on the edge, do you ever do that tablet woven band to reinforce and strengthen the edge?
That's actually kind of what it's for.
That tablet woven edge is there
Yeah.
to support the buttons.
Yeah.
Usually, so I'm doing it on just this wool here, but usually when I do this, it's on like it's on the front edge of the Code RD for my wife, and usually when I've done that, it's been there's a second layer, so it's folded. There's either a facing, which is also in textiles and clothing. It's either a facing or it's a line.
Please don't.
So okay. So what I end up doing is I'm gonna let me see if I can flip this so that you get the contrast to this thing here. So I'm gonna put this through, and then I'm gonna put it through the button again, and I'm gonna leave a little bit. I'm gonna leave a little bit of. I'm not gonna pull it tight down onto the edge there. I'm leaving a little bit of gap in the thread right there, because that's going to become the shank of your button, right? So I'm going to go ahead and put that through again. And again, this is one where, as I'm putting this on here, I'm going to kind of go crisscross through the bottom of the button there, because I had done that, you know, before I put the button on to give it a little more stability, and then this is just going to be that much more. So I'm just, you know, crisscrossing back and forth through there. And it doesn't take much. I mean, you don't really need a lot to hold this on. But again, I'm leaving that bit of gap right there. Right. So can you see that? How we got that gap right there in the thread? So now, once I've got that through, I am going to. I'm taking the thread and I'm just wrapping it around those threads that gap that I'd left there. Can you see that? And then again, I'm just gonna loop that through. So I don't know if you can really see. See how that's created the shank right there to hold that on. So, and that's pretty solid. I mean, it doesn't need to withstand a lot of stress, or at least it shouldn't be. It's basically just there to keep it closed. It's not there to, or I guess, keep your outfit from flying open. If you're channeling things well enough, it's going to be fit well enough that this is keeping it closed. It's not, the button isn't being used to, and like I said, there's not a huge stress load on there. So yeah, let's toss buttons. Any questions on that? Pretty neat, huh?
Them are cute.
I know. I think that's pretty much it, Adele. This is pretty much for you. So just want to make sure if you have any questions or if there's anything else I can clarify for you.
No, actually super helpful. And I can see that there are books I must invest in.
Yeah.
I'm actually a very accomplished seamstress in the mundane world. I have wedding dresses to my credit, but this is a whole different thing.
It is a very different thing. Yeah.
I mean, the skill set is there. It's just knowing how and what to apply. And this was very helpful. Very helpful.
Good.
I find with hand sewing, there's a paradigm shift that you kind of need to put your brain through just a little bit. Especially the idea, because obviously for the last like more than 100 years, all of our sewing has been take a piece of fabric, take another piece of fabric, sew it along the seam allowance, and then unfold it out and stuff, right? Because that's all built around sewing machines.
Right.
One of the most interesting things that I found, especially like the Museum of London book talks about this, another book called Woven into the Earth does this as well. A lot of people try to use it for like Viking clothing. It's actually much later than that, but it is medieval Greenland.
I was gonna say, but it was found in Greenland, so it must be Vikings.
Yeah, no, it postdates Vikings by several hundred years, but
yeah,
it's like the descendants of like Eric the Red in Greenland. And I think the earliest is maybe like 1300s, and then some even like later than that, 15th, very early 16th century even. The colony itself ended in like 1480 or something. So all these clothes that they buried people in, they would just wrap them in old clothing, started kind of coming up in floodwaters. So they did these huge, like, and there are complete garments. There are complete tunics, there are complete like coats and hats, and I think even some pants and things like that. And it's a other very thorough, like thorough analysis of all of the pieces, how they likely went together, because like the thread itself that sewed it together, it was apparently maybe the first thing to rot away. Or like maybe it was pulled apart and it was just used kind of as rags. It's hard to tell, but they talk about, anyway, both of those books, this is my greater point, talk about actually sewing sort of in 3 dimensions, where you would whip stitch a garment right next to the seam of the other part of the garment. And they would either be kind of flat, or like it's even possible to do this like on a person, and you can like whip stitch a seam in place in situ, basically, as part of a fitting process, which makes a lot of sense for something like the closer fitted like kirtles and cottardis of like 13th and 14th centuries. And that to me took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around, until I sort of realized it is because they didn't have sewing machines, like, and they didn't, so all of the sewing,
didn't have patterns.
They didn't have patterns. All of the sewing that they did was, descended from Neolithic era, basically, as opposed to what we do now, which is highly influenced by the sewing machine, which was like an utter game changer. And so that's the kind of whip stitching that I really like to do, is you fold down one side and you press it down really well. And then you match it over to the right side of the other fabric so that on the inside, the seam allowances are nice and folded together, but the part that you sew is actually the outside of the seam, is the visible edge of the fabric. Anyway.
Yep.
It's really cool. You kind of have to wrap your head around it.
You know, when she's talking about the Greenland finds, the woven into the earth stuff, you know, and the fact that, you know, a lot of people think that it's Viking because it was found in Greenland. One of my go-to sources for a long time now has been, well, my specialty, if you will, is the Boxton tunic, which was found in Varberg, Sweden. And I'd heard somebody once say that, well, it shouldn't be considered necessarily a Viking tunic, just based on where it is. And the reality is the Boxton tunic is dated to like 1340 to 1370. So that's right in the middle of the 100 Years' War. That's right in the middle of the 14th century. At that point, you know, what we think of, you know, Viking
the Vikings
clothing
by then.
is just early period clothing. It's not really Viking clothing. It was just, you know, I mean, when you look at like the Skoldenheim tunic, which can be as early as 950 to 1050 thereabouts, you know, that as well, just like the Boxton tunic, it's a one-piece body with a neck hole, 4 gores and 2 sleeves. You know, it's like we've been using the same basic construction techniques for 400 years. You know, so, but the Boxton is, I mean, one of the reasons that I love that so much is because it is one of the, it is just about the only complete set of clothing that we have for middle class medieval person that we know is dated to the 14th century. And it's the tunic, the hose, the hood, the cloak, the pouch, the whole thing. But that's what common people were wearing. And the reality is, even the nobility, they weren't wearing cotardis all the time. I mean, that's your business suit. Like that's what that's what they would wear for court. So what they were wearing just during the daytime was basically a Boxton. And when you look at period manuscripts where you see the pictures of farmers working in a field, if you look at the outfit that they're wearing, that's basically a Boxton tunic as well. So
would that be a good beginner project?
Yes, absolutely. And I have a handout that I've written for the Boxton tunic on what measurements to take. And again, it's not fitted, right? So it's all straight seam construction. I will tell you so the 4 gores that it has, if you're looking at entry level sewing, it has 4 gores. The 2 side gores go into the split. Those are super easy to do because you just pin them in and it just runs up with the seam. Forcing the gore, when you're putting a gore into a split of fabric, that is much more complicated. That's something that it just takes a bit of practice. But with the way that with what I have for my handout, I've taken an already simplified outfit, because that's the thing about the Boxton is what it is in period. It would have been an off the shelf or a one size fits all, you know, or even
Jeans
something
and t-shirt stuff.
or even something that somebody could make for themselves, right? It was designed to be stupid simple. And I've simplified it even more. There's a couple of things that I do that I don't really get into, but I've made it even easier. Mostly in that I've taken out the armpit gussets and I just use a larger arm's eye for that, a larger sleeve head.
Yeah,
but it is a
the
great
armpit
project.
Gussets are what makes
What's that?
the armpit gussets are what you need to be able to stand on your head comfortably and
Oh, is
raise
that
your
what it
arms
is?
overhead.
Well,
Yeah.
But you see, having the advantage of 56 wide fabric, I don't need the fabric conservation that they had. So I just make I just make a bigger arm's eye, and I just taper the sleeve down to the wrist. So yes, I am aware of the.
I'm in love with the underarm gusset. Modern clothes, if I buy a shirt, I take out the armpit and put in an underarm gusset so I can lift my arms without having the waist come up.
Well, so, this conversation begs the question, Your Grace, when did you last stand on your head?
It's been some time, I must admit. And I mean, had I armpit,
I stood on my hands this afternoon.
I mean, if I had armpit gussets, I might be standing on my head more frequently, honestly.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell.
It's the hands. It's standing on your hands you need it for this movement.
Oh, yeah. No, I've just taken with what I've done, and sometimes this is so the way I've done it with the larger sleeve head, sometimes referred to as a Knockert type 2 as opposed to Knockert type 1, and that is in reference to Margaret Knockert, who wrote this book. It's the Boxing Man book. Margaret Knockert is the lady that did all of the conservation of the Boxton. That's the cloak I just made yesterday. Yeah, the type 1 obviously would be with the armpit gussets and the gores being the appropriate sizes. But like I said, I've just made some changes to make it a little bit easier. So Black Wolf, this is a great project for you to start with, because it is all straight seams. And the thing that I'll tell you regarding the gores, for just getting into it to begin with, I would recommend just doing the side gores and not bothering with the front gores, because while the front gores obviously are more period, if you're looking at something that you can do for yourself to as an entry-level project, this is perfect for that. And you just leave out those front gores, and then when you're more comfortable with the basic sewing techniques, then I've got some resources for that, and I'd be happy to show you how to. Actually, I did a class on that. Me and Magdalena did tips and tricks a couple years ago, and I think I put that in there. So
yeah, this is very cool. Especially,
Go ahead, Black Wolf.
Oh, especially from hearing this from another fighter, because this is definitely not in my wheelhouse. So, I'm excited to try something out, to try something new. Is your fighter tunic built the same way?
Yep, absolutely. It's based on the boxing tunic.
Okay.
But because it's a fighting tunic, I use a serger.
That makes sense.
I'll either use a serger, or because I'm using linen for my fighting tunic, so you have to finish those edges somehow. So it's either going to be, you could do a flat felt seam, but for a fighting tunic, I'm not going to put that much effort into it.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'll use the serger, or I will do that with French seams. Do you understand the concept of French seams?
No.
So a French seam would be basically, I had another piece here. Hang on a second. Oh, okay. Let me. No, Alt N. So this is one that I sewed out on the machine because I thought I was going to show you the flat felt seam on this, and then I ended up doing it on the hand sewn one. So the concept of the French seam is you're basically folding the seam out. The iron works a lot better when it's plugged in. What you end up doing is with a French seam, with this, instead of doing the full 1/2 inch seam allowance here, I would hit this just right at the very edge of that, because what you're going to do is you're going to end up folding it over on top of itself, and you're going to be folding that seam down as well. So so we're going to take this here, and so we'll have, that's going to be your first stitch, and then you're going to fold it back on itself like this, and then you're going to sew that down as well, right? And so you're basically encasing that first stitch inside of itself, and so the finished edge is going to look like this, right? So it's going to be finished, but you are going to have, you're going to have a seam right there. Again, French seam is also period construction technique. Especially if you're using a machine, you're obviously going to have machine stitch on there. One of the other things that this does is if this ends up being your inside seam, it ends up being a little bit bulky. So you may be in a position where you end up tacking that down, where for me it's just easier to, I mean, it's almost less work to do the flat felt seam as it is to really finish this, because again, it's if that's where your seam is inside your clothes, you're going to have that much sticking out of it.
Yeah, I find it's really bulky.
Yeah, it is.
It's almost like a strip of boning.
Yeah, it is.
But the French seams work really well for inside of bags and pockets.
Yep. And when I'm using it for like my fighting tunic, I'm doing it because it's fast.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a serger, that's a way that you can get a fast seam. Like I said, inside a fighting tunic, which you don't want to spend a lot of time on. So the serger is a great tool for it. If you don't have a serger, you can also use like pinking shears. So I don't know what tools you have available for you for doing that, but yeah, the fighting tunic I make is the boxing tunic. One of the things I do with that is I make the body a little bit wider, and I make the arm side a little deeper as well, because that allows me to get it over my armor. Because if you make it so that it fits just like it does without your armor on, obviously it's just not going to fit as well.
I've been making
That's
fighting
awesome. Thank
tunics
you.
for over armor lately, taking the underarm gusset and continuing it down the body as a full rectangle. So you have body rectangle, front, back, side, side. That body rectangle comes into the arm as a triangle.
Yeah.
And then you stick triangle gussets between each rectangle. And suddenly you get a nice, full, comfortable fighting tunic that doesn't look too big, even though it's sized to go over your armor, and it just is flattering.
Yeah, that's actually putting those triangle gussets in there is basically what was done on the Charles de Blois, the Grand Assiette. But what you're talking about is not quite as, the shoulder's not quite as inset, but that's kind of how they end up doing that, is with those triangle gores into the the gores into the gores, or the gores into the gussets. Yeah. Alrighty, well, that's pretty much all I got for y'all. So unless you got any other questions.
Thank you, Duke. Sean, appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Very much.
As always. So, and I'm gonna stop recording.